All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome to this Crowdcast webinar on DAOs, hosted obviously by Messari. During this session, Messari founder and CEO Ryan Selkis will be speaking with three DAO entrepreneurs, Julia Rosenberg from Orca Protocol, Aaron Wright from OpenLaw, and Kevin Owocki from Gitcoin. We'll get right into the conversation, but first, just some quick housekeeping. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. That way attendees can sort of upvote and downvote, and then Ryan, our moderator today, can pull those during the discussion. Separately, Mainnet 2021, which is why we're doing these crowdcasts, that's Messari's annual summit, and it is next week, as in Monday through Wednesday, September 20th through 22nd in NYC. At the New York Marriott Marquis, and you'll see all these panelists there taking this conversation about DAOs even further. If you haven't registered for that summit already, after this, I'm going to drop a link in the chat so that you can grab your pass. That'll give you $450 off of your pass to come in person in New York City. But if you can't make the conference in person, we get that COVID is still wreaking havoc on people's travel plans. So we've spun up a virtual platform as well, and you can grab tickets for the virtual event through that link as well. But if you're in person though, and you see me running around the event, I've been helping Messari with marketing and social content, so please stop me and say hey. But otherwise, let's get into the conversation. Ryan, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bailey. And thank you all for joining today. So some people might be migrating over from the Senate Banking Committee hearings with Chairman Gensler. Aaron's smiling already, so I know he's among them. He made a comment that DeFi should be put in quotes because decentralization is often in name only within crypto. It's a common criticism. And we're going to talk about DAOs today. Decentralized autonomous organizations. Are DAOs decentralized in name only, or is this how we actually get from centralized shitcoins to decentralized communities that are actually community governed networks? What say you, Aaron?
I think that they're a part of the solution. I think that we've seen over the past year an explosion of folks that want to organize their projects, whether that's an open source DeFi based project, other projects like what Kevin is pulling together with Gitcoin, which is trying to fund more and more things through public goods, which is completely fascinating. And then we're also seeing other experiments with pooling together capital, and DAOs are really the solution there. I think that the long-term vision, and some groups are closer to achieving this or have achieved it, and others are on the pathway, is to make sure that a common core treasury is not managed by one or two people or a software development team, but by its community. And I think at both the tech level, at the governance level, and at the structuring level, we've made great strides this year to do that. And so I think the tokens that you referred to before, which I wouldn't characterize the way you characterize it, Ryan, I think that we're seeing a lot of value and taking a step up this notion of having community governed software, community governed investments, community governed funding of different stripes, and community governed organizations more broadly. That's the trend line, and that's the direction where we're going. And I think there's been a lot of progress over the past year.
Before we bring in Julia and Kevin, Aaron, you're a resident professor and lawyer. So let's start with a definition. How would you define a DAO, or is it more of a design space?
Yeah, I think it's a design space. So at least as initially conceived, and to give a quick history lesson, so the notion of DAOs really started with Dan Larimer of EOS fame, amongst others. In 2013, he began to think about what it could look like to run a corporation on Bitcoin, which was super fascinating. And he coined this term, pun intended, called the decentralized autonomous corporation. That concept got generalized into this notion of a DAO, which prominently was featured in the Ethereum white paper. What qualifies as a DAO, is somewhat debatable, and it's pretty broad in terms of its scope. But the one core idea is to have an organization that's ideally leaderless. It doesn't have a board of directors. It doesn't have one central party that's in control. It's really being stewarded by a broader group of stakeholders, participants, supporters, developers, in order to push things forward. So it's more open-ended, it's more fluid, it's less hierarchical. In my mind, I think that that's one way to think about it. And I think that that's kind of directionally how we're seeing things evolve on the internet. It's less top down and it's much more like a swarm or a group of people kind of swirling around an idea. In terms of what we're seeing kind of in the market, and last point, I see it, we're seeing kind of a couple different categories like protocol level DAOs, which are supporting different open source, mostly DeFi projects or other projects like Gitcoin. And then we're also seeing kind of investment DAOs emerge, and then also seeing groups of people want to work together. So kind of like a modern riff on a corporation or kind of an evolution of a co-op in some capacity. So it's a wide open space, lots of different categories, still some definitional challenges, but in the crypto space, we're used to that. We're not great with definitions and like to sometimes misname things.
Kevin, Gitcoin has been the bleeding edge of actually allocating resources from decentralized balance sheets. And when I think about DAOs, I just think of a community governed balance sheet, really. That could be for anything. It could be for pool of investment capital. It could be tokens that are valueless governance tokens that may one day accrue value if the underlying network has value. How do you think about the role of allocating funds from a community treasury and whether that's kind of part and parcel to a DAO? Can you have treasury list DAOs or is allocating some type of funding, token or otherwise, part and parcel to being a decentralized organization?
Yeah, really great question. And thanks for having me, everyone. So Gitcoin is a place that you can get coins if you're a software engineer. And we recently launched a DAO. It's actually a fork of compound governance style where you can delegate to your votes to other people. One of the sort of funny things about everyone talking about governance in the space is that maybe only 5% of token holders will participate in governance. And by allowing you to delegate to other token holders your voting power, it allows for, I think, a better balance of incentives versus time spent in the DAO. I think that DAOs, like Aaron said, are a design space, and we're going to see all sorts of organizations of varying degrees of decentralization and autonomousness. DAO standing for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. I think we're going to see treasury-less DAOs, and we're going to see DAOs with treasuries in them. I'm focused on building web scale mechanisms for funding public goods and building crypto ecosystems. And Gitcoin is pretty long on this mechanism called quadratic funding, which is a way of funding a ecosystem alongside your community. And so I think that there's a really wide open design space right here. And there's certainly a lot more heat in DAOs where there's treasuries because tokens talk and tokens are an incentive alignment mechanism. And so I think that a lot more people are spending time on places where you can do resource allocation with Turing complete smart contracts. It's never been seen before. This design space has so much upside and it's so huge. And I'm really curious to see what people are going to build over the next several years.
The design space is one element of it, but you can only get so far if people aren't actually engaged and participating in some of the decision making within these communities. And Julie, I think that's where you and Orca come in. So talk a little bit about what your vision is for the DAO ecosystem and how Orca might be able to solve some of the problem in developing quorum and just generally getting people to actively participate and make decisions in a more efficient way.
Yes, the casual bottlenecks that Kevin just mentioned of 5% voting. So the way I really think about DAOs and what we're building at Orca is that we sort of define ourselves as like a people first protocol that I think we forget a lot of the times when we are building DAOs and working with these complex mechanisms and tokenomics and all of these crazy things in DAOs, that the thing that we're organizing is just people and human collaboration. So how can we best capture that human collaboration and scale that properly? And I think that's a massive problem that we see in the space today, is that we have these crazy, robust, loose ecosystems of contributors without really any infrastructure to guide them accordingly. So that's really what we're doing with Orca, is figuring out how we can sort of create these small working groups of people to build governance around people based on their expertise rather than just their tokens and their holdings. And I think that's a really big unlock when you sort of empower these groups of people and actually give them some delegated control and power within the ecosystem, that you'll start to see a whole new wave of ecosystem contribution that we're not seeing today, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And I guess aside from the quorum issue, I mean, is that really what it comes down to? What do you see as some of the biggest challenges in this formative phase for DAOs? Because I feel like we had, everybody's going to define it a little bit differently, but let's call it 3 eras, right? There's the DAO era, and like the post the DAO era, which was, this is a really cool experiment, it was a total disaster, and then we were just in like a couple of years of fallow. And then we had, I call it the Moloch DAO and the Lao era, which was more or less around the same time, Aaron, where some of those kind of early experiments and new frameworks emerged that people started experimenting around. And now it seems like we're going through like the third wave of innovation, where things are really exploding, and people recognize that there are a lot of applications for DAOs, and B, just a tremendous amount riding on success here from a regulatory standpoint, because we are going to get it to a point in different jurisdictions, the U.S. already arguably, where if you are not decentralized and you're developing a protocol, you are at great risk without some type of coordinating function that is decentralized. So where are the ugly risks right now? Is it still technical? Is it just community, getting people's attention? Where you're all working on different aspects of this, but I'm curious if there's common themes.
I think it's all three, Ryan, and I think you kind of teed that up. There's still a number of technical challenges, kind of in that first wave post-DAO. With the DAO itself, we saw lots of great projects like Aragon, DAO Stack, a handful of others, and they were amazing, right? They built amazing tech, really started painting the picture of what the vision could look like. Due to challenges with ETH in terms of gas cost management, it's not yet ready for scale. And that's created some complications. I think those are going to be addressed next couple quarters, which I think is great. We're working on some solutions. I know a bunch of other teams are too. On the regulatory side, I think we've made some progress. We passed a bill in Wyoming, which enables some sort of DAOs to operate and at least be recognized. And not perfect, lots of challenges still there and things to work through, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think what we're going to see for more mature DeFi DAOs and other DAOs that we saw launch over the past year or so, is just more structure applied to them so that they can align and interact with the real world. These organizations are growing quite large. If you look at Uniswap or Compound or some of these other projects, Gitcoin, they're the real deal, right? They're not going away. They're making a huge impact and will continue to do that. They're going to become household names, and they're going to need to interact with kind of the meat space world. And I think that there's some pathways for that too. And then last, I do think on the governance side, particularly in DeFi, there was an overweighting on quorum-based voting, mostly to protect certain parties' interests, which is understandable. I actually think the Moloch style voting, which is via rough consensus, or the more forward-leaning voting and governance systems like Kevin's exploring, that's probably the path forward, at least in my mind. So that's kind of where I see the challenges and the things that will hopefully get addressed. We'll improve governance, hopefully get more clarity on the regulatory side and structuring side, and the tech, it's getting there, right? But it's still pretty early.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, again, it's a really big people and community problem. And I think those are all tied into the technical and sort of governance regulatory side of it as well. I think obviously the biggest challenge is how do you sort of decentralize power and control away from these centralized protocol teams. And I think a big reason why there's been this massive third wave of DAOs and people have gone so excited about them is just the idea of kind of shared ownership and control. But I think in practice, that's not really how it works today. I think a lot of communities have felt powerless in their ability to actually affect change within these ecosystems. And I think that's a a big problem that we have to work on is how can we actually like foster participation and contribution in these ecosystems, which is like what we're working on with Orca, what Gitcoin's working on. So yeah, I would say again, that's like a people problem with technical constraints.
Kevin, follow the money. You can solve a lot of human coordination problems if you're just triaging the capital. So what have you learned from being arguably one of the largest facilitators of incentives for DAO participants?
Yeah. Well, I want you to quote me on this. Don't launch a token and focus on your mission way before you do launch a token or a DAO. From the start, we've been focused on our mission of growing and sustaining open source software and building a mechanism for software developers to get coins. And just focusing on that mission and that intrinsic motivation, I think was really key for the start for us. One of my Gen Z counterparts might say, focus on the vibes before you focus on the crypto economics. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's true. In 2017, there was this misnomer that like if you take a human and you put in a token, you will get out an action. And people just don't work that way. They're not that rational. And so one of the things that we've been really successful with, I think, is just being laser focused on that mission, even as Gitcoin has evolved from a consensus project to a company to a DAO, and then layering the token and the governance sort of on top of that mission from there. Humans are way more intrinsically motivated, I think, especially when it comes to good causes, than we give them credit for. And that's what's been successful for us. The DAO is just a worldwide coordination mechanism to help this egregore, this group of people with a common mission and common thought, facilitate their goals. And what's great about it is that if you're not in the United States, then you can use the DAO in order to coordinate with us. So if we were a company, then you'd have to fly out to New York and sue us if you had a dispute with us. But now, since we have decentralized governance, people can participate from all over the world, and that's opened up millions more people to Gitcoin's possible target market. So it's a really exciting time. But I think that core knowing very simply in one sentence or less why your DAO exists, I think is really important in a time when people have short attention.
Yeah, it's impossible to talk about DAOs, and Kevin kind of hinted at it, without talking about the regulatory differences between the US and Europe in particular. I don't want to leave out the rest of the world, but just given the time zones that we're in, it's the middle of the night in Asia. I'm going to assume that our audience today is primarily Western based. So can you talk a little bit about maybe two things, and I'll combine the first two questions from the audience here. Just the differences in thinking about DAO structuring and building a DAO, depending on where your teams are, physically located, if that matters, in the U.S. and Europe, and maybe what are the benefits of incorporating a DAO, which, Aaron, I know you have some experience with, both with the Lao and then the work that's gone on in Wyoming. So we can start with any of the three of you, but I'd love to hear just how you're navigating the design space constraints as DAOs interface with the real world.
I'm happy to pick that up. Yeah, so this has been a looming question since even before the launch of Ethereum. There was some early meetings at MIT where people were talking about Bitcoin, Ethereum, and kind of the future of crypto. And this question about how do groups of people that are organizing online begin to interact with the real world. One concept that we've implemented along with some others is wrapping a DAO in an existing legal structure in the US. The advantages to that is it kind of clarifies some legal risks. It limits liability. It limits other obligations that I won't go into the weeds with, but are beneficial if you want to participate and or have capital. And it also, and I see the question in the chat, enables the ability to enter into contracts with others. So if a DAO wants to interact with the real world, hire people, contract with some meat space related thing, it's easier to do that. We've kind of successfully deployed that across, at this point, 8 DAOs that are part of the Lao network. It's has about $200+ million of Ether that's been contributed, purchased 1,800 NFTs, backed 90+ projects, deployed millions of dollars into DeFi, and also enables us to do things like deliver K1s to all of the members and deal with all the compliance related matters. So I think kind of increasingly as these DAOs emerge from kind of their childhood phase and become more mature, the need for more structuring will be important. Fortunately, in the US, and this goes to the US versus EU question, the US is very flexible in terms of organizational structure. It's a lot like a McDonald's. There's a whole menu of different organizations that you can create, from corporations to co-ops to lots of different things in between. So we have maximum amount of flexibility here on the corporate law side. That's not the same in the rest of the world. The rest of the world, at least my understanding, it may not be perfect. Oftentimes you need to appoint a manager, someone that's in charge of the organization, which frankly just cuts against the whole ethos of DAOs. I think some folks want to build dictator DAOs where they're just basically like in charge. To me, like a dictator DAO is like an STO. It's just do it the old-fashioned way. You really should be trying to build leaderless organizations, I think, to capture a lot of value that that Kevin was describing, and I think other folks are kind of aspiring for.
I wanted to jump on that, and Aaron just mentioned this. Like, I think there's a lot of confusion in this DAO space. Like, if I'm in a DAO, does that mean I'm just like have no legal risk whatsoever? And that's not the case. Like, that's a big part in why DAOs exist, is decentralizing legal risk. And I do worry that, like, as we start to incorporate these DAOs, if they start to look more like traditional orgs, and that we lose, like Aaron just said, kind of like the core ethos of what a DAO is, in decentralizing power and moving away from these sort of dictator structures. And I think that there's like a key difference here too, and like the autonomy aspect of the decentralized autonomous organization. When there is a lack of automation in a DAO, incorporation is absolutely necessary, because that's when human input is needed, and that's when risks start to surface. But when you sort of like start to incorporate and like have, centralized legal structures that are beholden to certain regulations in certain jurisdictions, you do lose some of that autonomy, and you're sort of forced to follow those legal regulations. And you have a board of director, and you start to adopt a very similar traditional org structure. So I think that there's like still a lot of innovation to be had here, and like something that we've sort of thought about at Orca is spinning up sort of infrastructure pods and having specific pods and groups that are tasked with services of providing legal infrastructure or access to centralized services in the real world. Like, for example, setting up an Amazon Web Services account in the US. And that is like the one job of that sort of small working group. That way you sort of like minimize the potential points of failure within this DAO ecosystem.
Got anything to add?
I got nothing to add here, Ryan. I'll pass.
Yeah, and
Good.
Can I add one point? Yeah, Julia, I think that's completely right. The one tricky part is, and I think we're seeing this as space has grown crypto, the law doesn't evaporate, right? You call yourself a DAO, right. You operate globally. In the US and Europe and other parts, they will easily fit that into existing legal structures, and your liability is actually incredibly high if you participate in a DAO. It's arguably the worst structure on the planet, which is a general partnership. And that is at some point going to blow up. And I'm not really, I don't like to be kind of the doomsday person, but it's definitely going to happen. And that's going to create a lot of complications, a lot of pain, and a lot of really nasty problems. So, that's why I think you're seeing an effort to kind of press in some of these structuring points, but we'll get there. And hopefully it's something lightweight and something that works and kind of maintains that ethos. But just to be clear, like right now, if you're in an unincorporated DAO, you're likely in a general partnership, worst possible position to be in, especially if you have other assets.
We've lost our host.
I think we lost Ryan.
We lost our fearless leader.
Oh yeah. Hey, hi guys. It's Bailey from the back end. I will just go ahead and ask another question on that point. So I've been like frivolously taking notes here, and so trying to get on the right page. But so I guess when you're saying, so explain to me, because I'm not super well versed in this, in some of the business language. But explain again, like what that general partnership means as it relates to the DAO structure, and why that is like not a good thing not the best business to be in.
Yeah, sure. So general partners are liable to the other members for anything that goes wrong. So if you're kind of viewing DAOs as these more open, permissionless organizations, which is the core vision, and something goes wrong, somebody gets hurt, there's some action where the organization is responsible for it, then each person, joint and separately, is on the hook for that. So just imagine if you're like in a like a lot of people like to analogize. I like this analogy. In part, DAOs can be thought of as like something like a subreddit with a bank account and more rules related to it. Imagine if you were considered a partner for everybody in a subreddit. Just picture that in your mind, and that's basically what the kind of legal requirements are now. So you could be responsible for any shitposter, anybody that makes a mistake, anybody that enters into a contract on behalf of the DAO. There's a lot of liability. It may not matter for you individually, but if you're that's a tricky proposition. So we're seeing some folks just kind of YOLO in, even if they have a lot of capital, but I think at some point they're going to get burned, and we'll have a little bit of a day of reckoning. So putting a little thought into the structuring off the bat tends to make sense, and that's something that's been recognized by lots of different folks that have thought about this for a number of years.
Yeah, that Reddit analogy is truly terrifying. But Ryan, I'll pass it back over to you.
Is it possible to enter into any type of legally binding contract now in the U.S., internationally, anywhere in between, that without having some type of incorporation? Because Aaron, you mentioned K1s and just facilitating employment contracts and things like that. Is there any way that you could be employed by a DAO without it being incorporated? Or do business at scale with a DAO without it being incorporated? And how do we see this playing out over time?
Yeah, you definitely can. You would have to think about it like a partnership. So partnerships can employ people. It's just not a great way to do business. We kind of went through this exercise from the early 1900s to the 1970s, and the whole world pretty much said that they didn't want to operate as partnerships to the extent that they all moved over to limited liability entities for corporations. But yeah, like noting before, in the Lao network, we enter into contracts all the time on behalf of the members, and the members enter into them, and it works really well. So, and I think you'll start to see other structures that can basically do the same thing, that are a little bit more lightweight.
Julia, when you think about managing funds and resources, have you thought at all about the risks or how to kind of mitigate some of the risks and liabilities for committee members in some of these subgroups that are ultimately making decisions? Because right now, every single micro decision is essentially a proxy vote. And what you're all developing at Orca breaks that down to smaller subcomponents and gives people a little bit more authority. You almost get into directors and managers and particular decision makers. Do they have liability? What's the solution towards incentivizing people to do work without putting them at risk if they make a mistake?
Yeah, I probably can't speak to the liability aspect as well as probably like Aaron could. But again, like I sound like a broken record. I think this comes down to a people first problem, and that when you have sort of like these smaller working groups of people, it's much more obvious like how resources need to be distributed. Whereas in like DAO ecosystems today, it's very difficult to identify that and properly like incentivize and attribute value to work being contributed into these ecosystems. So, we're definitely of like the same thought as Gitcoin, that we have to be really specific in creating these like core working groups and initiatives, and how we can properly like fund and attribute resources to each of those things.
This is maybe a group question, but in terms of workers or contributors to a DAO, how often is it a contractor, an employment relationship, or something else entirely, where maybe they're just the recipient of a bounty or some type of reward? And how have the various teams that you've worked with navigated just the payouts if it's not coming directly from the protocol, even if it has to be kind of co-signed through a multi-sig, through some type of governance vote? What is the end result to ensure that the proper documentation is in place for whoever the contributor is worldwide?
Yeah, so Gitcoin actually recently partnered with Bankless DAO in order to commission a report on DAO coordination. So that's everything from the demographics of DAO members to how do they operate with each other to how much do they make. And basically, there were tools that were used in order to compensate contributors. A majority of it was project-based or bounties. There's a tool called Coordinate, which is doing quite well in the Ethereum ecosystem. That was the number one way that people earned their tokens. And hourly, just working for the DAO hourly, was the fifth most popular way of coordinating contributors for the DAO. So I'll just really quickly pass a link along to this DAO survey, which we had 500 respondents to all over the world, and there's just a ton of data about how people are working for many different DAOs in the ecosystem in that report. So encourage you all to check that out.
Anything to add on that? Aaron, you've had a bunch of different structures in terms of payouts.
Yeah, I mean, in our structures are a bit smaller due to regulatory constraints. So each one of the DAOs has up to 99 members. It's very flat and people hop in. It's a bit different because people are pooling their own capital and deploying it. So they're already incentivized to do work for the DAO. So it's a bit less formal. There's no payouts that are being paid to specific parties to do things, and people hop in. I'll give you like some examples. In Flamingo DAO, we purchased this, what's now a high value, rare CryptoPunk. And some members were having fun with it. They turned it into a 3D avatar. They deployed it into a metaverse. They began to play Dark Forest, which is an NFT-based game with it. You know, people are just kind of piling in. We have other members that are running marketing and just doing it every Friday because they think it's in their interest to do so. And then we have other folks that are doing more data analytics type related work. So no payouts are occurring. Instead, kind of the coordination is occurring by pooling capital. So it's a bit flatter of a structure. Maybe that is the shape of how things look in the future, where people are not being paid by the hour. They don't feel like they're working for something. They're kind of voluntarily contributing, more like in the vein of a Wikipedia than in the vein of a corporation.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way we sort of see it happening with Orca pods is that it can be both like a top-down structure in that a team figures out like services that they need for the organization and can sort of create these pods with open memberships for someone to fill. So let's say Bankless creates like a marketing pod and there's 8 seats available for members to fill with certain requirements that they have to meet in order to, you know, be compensated in a certain way. But I also think the reverse can happen in that you can have sort of these highly motivated people grouped together and form pods and sort of become its own little service mini DAO and click on to ecosystems and provide services and move away to different ecosystems when they want to, like, as they wish. So I think there's still like a lot of development that we'll see in that direction. Like Coordinate is a great example. But yeah, I think again, it's just sort of figuring out how people want to contribute to these ecosystems.
One of the biggest things that strikes me about DAOs, any type of decentralized conversation around governance, is just the accessibility, standardization, discoverability. How do you actually make decisions? How do you enter discussions? What tools do you have for benchmarking or understanding what the hell is going on? Because if you just try to gamify votes and say, okay, if you've participated in X number of snapshot signals, then you're going to get an airdrop for being an active participant. Well, all that really does is incentivize people to come and click an online poll. It doesn't actually incentivize any type of robust discussion or contribution to a given topic necessarily. So where are you seeing the best kind of tooling emerge? Where are the destinations that people can go aside from Discord servers, which can be a mess, to figure out how to get actively involved and actively participate? Or is it very bespoke on a project by project basis?
I mean, I think Discord is probably the best tool at this point, just for organizing the conversation, along with Snapshot and then a DAO framework of some sort. with Gnosis. That seems to be a bit of it. I think Coordinate, like Kevin mentioned before, super interesting project in terms of trying to pay folks. There's a lot of emerging projects that are, I think, will be a piece of this. Orca, Parcel, a handful of other projects that are trying to deal with payments or organization. So it's emerging, and I think that's the opportunity if you're more of a developer. The tech is not there yet. It feels a lot like NFTs before the recent NFT run-up. The tech is starting to come into focus, but there's definitely a lot of work that still needs to be done. But I think we're going to get to a point where there's no front end. You're going to have lots of things organized in Discord or something that's more threaded, or maybe a more modern version of Discord, where people are congregating around ideas. There's votes that aren't happening through a snapshot hub, but just through upvotes or downvotes. And then it's going to trigger smart contract-based transactions. You're not going to need any tokens in your wallet. Your address needs to be whitelisted. You may not need any Ether or some other asset in your wallet, and you'll be able to do on-chain transactions. So that's where I imagine if we did this in a year from now, we're going to start to see that really come into focus. And that is when I think you're going to get to the point where it's not just crypto whales and DeFi degens that are really playing around in DAOs. That's when we'll move it more towards the mainstream.
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the things that we've been fairly happy with at Gitcoin is, in Gitcoin DAO, is that basically delegation has been a pretty core tool for us. When you got your GTC retroactive distribution, we made everyone there do a delegation of their governance rights. And the reason for that was that lots of people maybe want to hold GTC, but they don't want to be involved in day-to-day decision making for the DAO. And so we've got 18,000 token holders, I think, these days, and they're all aggregated into 100. There's 100 people that aggregate a vast majority of the voting power. And so making sure that those people are informed about what their stewards, which is what we call the people who have the aggregated voting power, are doing, and then they can they can withdraw their consent of the governed at any time, has been pretty powerful for us, because people can still have their opinions represented, but without spending any time on governance at all. And by having 40 or 60 people to get in a room together, or a Zoom room, in the post-pandemic world, when there's a decision to be made, just makes it way less unwieldy than if there's thousands of people to be making a decision. And yeah, plus one on what Aaron said, Discord is great, Discourse is great, Snapshot is great, and it's about having good faith conversations between people who are mission aligned. That has been what's worked for us. And I feel like I'm always making these like points which feel counterintuitive to the decentralization and the mutability maximalists out here, because I feel like I'm talking about a lot of social layer things when it comes to DAO, and not technology layer things. And that's where the best practices and the vibes are. So that's what's worked for us.
Kevin, Lee has a good question, which was one that I was going to follow up on with at least a similar flavor. And she asked, what's the difference between members of a company voting to appoint a board of directors versus what you did with the retroactive distribution, which is essentially the same, voting to delegate authority, other than maybe the board directors are unequal votes?
Right. Yeah. Oh man, I'm like making side eyes at Aaron over here because he's the lawyer, and I just don't really know the difference between those two structures, and can't speak to it too much. I don't know, Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think the big difference is boards tend to be a bit more fixed, at least in terms of duration. So if you're appointed to a board, to remove somebody from a board is a pretty cumbersome process. It's going to depend on how the corporation's structured. But I think what Kevin and other projects are experimenting with, this idea of leaning into quadratic voting, delegates, etc., you're beginning to create more liquid and fluid structures, which presumably would be more responsive to the folks that are participating in the community. And that's fascinating. So I think just because we're talking about DAOs and organizations doesn't mean this lessons that we've learned over the past 200 plus years just evaporate. There's a lot of wisdom embedded in those structures, a lot of like hard fought lessons. But I think thinking about them for a world that's real time, thinking about them in a context of the internet and not the industrial age, is kind of the direction that we're moving. So does that person that is a big delegate have more responsibility? Maybe. Does that mean they have more, legal responsibility? Possibly. It's not clear yet. But I think, experimenting with these more liquid forms of decision making is where the magic's going to happen. That's how we're going to evolve away to something that's beyond kind of a corporate or top-down form. And if you love the corporate or top-down form, that's great. I'm not in that camp. I think we see a lot of problems with that. And that's why I'm interested in DAOs, working on DAOs. I want to build better structures, right? And this stuff matters. Coordination matters. Ethereum's a coordination machine. And that's really what we're pushing towards collectively as an ecosystem, in my humble opinion.
I also think it comes down to accountability in this question. Like when you vote for your board of directors, like Aaron said, it's like a very cumbersome process to then like remove them, like very similar to our elected officials in governance, which I know you love to talk about, Ryan. And I think like with how Gitcoin has structured it, like you can undelegate your vote if like you're like, hey, I do not like how you just voted on this thing. I disagree. Like I'm gonna delegate my votes elsewhere. And it starts to become this like much more fluid system of where you put, like where you attach value in the ecosystem according to, your own values.
You've spent a bit of time thinking about this, I'm sure, Juliet, but the one token, one vote mantra is something that is baked into the Orca pod concept. The other governance models that we've seen have unequal voting power depending on how many tokens are held or proxied to a certain representative. Have you thought about the trade-offs, and is Orca flexible to accommodate for both models, or are you going to continue to stick with one token, one vote, more of this kind of traditional board structure when it comes to decision making?
Yeah, so within the pod, it is one token, one vote, or we actually like to say like one membership, one vote. But like we see them working with the governance ecosystems we see today. So, you could delegate the sort of rule making abilities of the pod to a compound Governor Bravo contract, meaning that the entire, token, like ecosystem of token holders can vote and decide like who gets to sit on these pods and these sort of subcommittees. But I think it's important to have sort of like these mini flat ecosystems where your voice and your contributions are equal to those around you. And that's sort of like how decision making happens. Like Kevin talked about this, like if you get 60 people on a Zoom call together, like nothing is going to happen there. Like if you have 5 people with equal amounts of power sitting there trying to make a decision together, like it's much more likely that you can get to, consensus among that group of people. So I think it's really important to have like these flatter ecosystems within, the governance structures we see today. I think Kevin can probably, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think, I was going to say, I'm sure Kevin can speak to that as well, when what he's saying with Gitcoin's DAO and how it's structured.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I forgot the question. What was it, Ryan?
Well, I think Julie had a question. I was going to ask a separate question.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Well, my question is going to be, we've talked about the design space of DAOs and how they're managed and ultimately where some of the early applications could be. But let's talk about the way to launch a DAO post initial vibe offering. I guess, Kevin, like what's the right way to actually bring it to market the right way? Structure it in a way that you can accept a certain number of members, potentially take in outside capital, all the things that typically we kind of take for granted, and the rules depending on your law firm are a little bit different, but these are there's kind of norms now around token sales or investment in companies that may do a token sale in the future, and there doesn't seem to yet be much standardization around DAO formation and fundraising, aside from maybe Aaron, what you all have done with the LAO documents. How have you all thought about bringing these to market and helping other teams think about the best practices when it comes to forming their own communities?
Yeah, I mean, on our end, we handle it from soup to nuts, from the structuring and setup, the onboarding, including some basic compliance to get things moving. We provide all the DAOs with a DApp that they can use to start coordinating, and using our new Tribute DAO framework, they're increasingly able to do more on-chain activity, make that a bit more modular and extensible. We have a community support, so I think part of the reason why some of the DAOs that we pull together have worked well is we have somebody that's like a mod on a subreddit or a whip in Congress that helps people focus on what to vote on. So kind of summarizing or pushing certain decision-making processes that it looks like the members want to push forward along is super helpful to kind of achieve rough consensus. And then we handle the kind of the tax and compliance pieces. Our approach is not turnkey. It's curated, so all the DAOs, we have about 8 of them now that have been launched. They're all determined and kind of facilitated by the existing members of the DAOs. So the LAO kind of beget Flamingo. The LAO also kind of seeded the concept around Neptune, which is a DeFi DAO. Now Flamingo has kind of metastasized into Play to Earn DAO, Ready Player DAO. We also have a DAO that's focused on the Zedrun ecosystem. We also have a DAO forming around this high-priced CryptoPunk, the Alien, and we also have a Metaverse DAO that's forthcoming. And it also has kind of branched outside of more investment DAOs into an internet museum that's called Museo. So I think kind of a curated model makes some sort of sense to make sure that there's market demand for it. Getting things right off the bat is helpful in the long run. I think the other path is, it's the IVO. I think we just coined that, the initial vibes offering related to DAOs, which is more of the YOLO approach. I think everybody in crypto loves the YOLO approach. So we've seen people just set up a multi-sig, collect capital, and make a run at it. I think there's a lot of wisdom to that and moving fast. I think the question is, when does that hit kind of a logical ceiling before folks step in and say, you can't do that. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, the things that I like to see when DAOs are launched is that they're launched upon fertile ground. So, I mean, as opposed to creating like the 100th vegetable coin or like loot clone, then I think, for me, the DAOs that are interesting are something that establish something new. And, some amount of derivation is natural and good. We are in a world where open source and forkability is a feature, not a bug, but there has to be something original and there has to be a fertile ground there. And one of the things I like to see is people who've been listening and vibing with people for years, understanding the space before they actually create something is a pattern that I've seen. And once you do that, I think you want to choose the right tool for the job. And, the simplest thing is just to have a Gnosis safe with a bunch of key holders that you share with. And then, the more you can use Compound, you can use DAO House, you can use Aragon, you can use Moloch DAO. Just choose the right tool for the job for what you want your governance structure to be, and start as simple as possible, and then let the complexity and the growth sort of emerge from those simple seeds. And I don't think that there's one way to launch a DAO, and I think that's a feature, not a bug. In a world in which there's decentralization, there's going to be a number of different DAO frameworks of assets, and probably even L1 chains that you can launch DAOs on. And that's great because we're in a Cambrian explosion of different assets and coordination tools, and no one knows what the winner is going to be. And I don't think I could pick what the best way to launch a DAO would be without the benefit of hindsight. Ask me in 2035 what the best way to launch a DAO was in 2021. I think we'll know the answer by then. But right now it's about experimenting and iterating, failing fast, and starting simple and letting complexity emerge from there.
I would echo that. And I think what we're seeing a lot today is like a lot of like analysis paralysis. Like people get very caught up in like, what tool am I going to use? What structure, the incentives, like how is everything going to click together? And I would echo what Kevin said. Like, I think things need to start as simple as possible, which is like very much our ethos at Orca, is like you have like this little wrapper around people. And we're a wrapper around a Gnosis safe, and we're basically creating the ability to start like clicking these pods together and start forming these ecosystems as the organization itself develops, rather than organizations sort of having to mold themselves to the needs of a structure. So I think just like starting as simple as possible and finding tools and these coordination Legos to click together that grow with your organization.
So to recap, vibes, YOLO, Discord chats, right?
And I think also
that's it.
I think you need. Yeah, I do think that this notion, I think it's overlooked. We've seen, I completely agree with Kevin that there's going to be a lot of experimentation, but people under index the need to have somebody that's shepherding things along. I think it makes a big difference. People are busy. People are not going to want to contribute full time to things. So you need somebody that almost is like a whip in Congress or like a mod in a subreddit. Not all subreddits are great. And I think they also kind of go to Kevin's point about vibes. They can kind of create a pleasant environment where people want to participate. So I think
more community organizer versus protocol politician.
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, the protocol politician is a fascinating concept, but I think the community piece really is important. And it's not that different from other kind of communal organizations. I did a lot with Wikipedia, and a lot of folks that spend time on it, they were doing that community building piece. And that's in part why that's such a spectacular and legendary icon of the internet. It's just really focused on community first.
Well, I would vote for all of you in protocol political elections, and probably in real life too.
When are you running, Ryan?
Van Hollen stayed away from crypto, if you notice in his remarks, so he didn't lose anything. So I guess we've got a few minutes left here. I'd love to maybe just get if you could kind of boil down your thesis on DAOs and kind of where things will evolve in the next 6 to 12 months. There's been a little bit of buzz around like, okay, is it going to be DAO season, right? Or DAO is the next big narrative play within crypto. And that always sounds a little bit funny to me, because DAOs are like the meta organizational structure for so many of these ecosystems. So if it's not like DAO season, quote unquote, like what are you looking forward to the next 6 to 12 months? Is like maybe like the big milestone that we hit, the big KPI to keep an eye on, the interesting projects to watch outside of your own. I'm curious, like what you're excited about going into 2022.
Yeah, well, I could start this. I mean, I think just taking a step back, a year and a half ago, February 2020, there was about $7 million in DAOs and a couple thousand people playing around with them. Depending on the metrics, it's now over $7 billion with hundreds of thousands of people that are participating. Or arguably, it's a little bit hard to calculate it. I can tell you what we're pushing towards in the DAO ecosystem. Right now, there's about $200 million in capital that's been contributed. I think you'll see over the next year that eclipse into the billions, which is pretty notable. We're having lots of different folks participate in it. In my mind, the long-term trend is this is the structure for the internet age. The last time we were at this inflection point was in the late 70s, early 80s, when the LLC kind of seeped its way out of Wyoming and transformed Wall Street, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley, and the way people work. I think we're at a similar inflection point. We're more focused on kind of that investment end at this point and the tech tooling underneath it. But I think that means that you're going to see structures that outperform GP-LP structures like venture capital funds and hedge funds. I think that it's going to be flatter, more responsive, and eventually just kind of gobble up those important ecosystems. I think another area where we're going to see a tremendous amount of growth, it's not DeFi DAOs. We'll obviously see growth there, but I think we'll see DAOs take root with NFT ecosystems in more substantive ways over the next 18 months. And that's something that we're also pretty laser focused on. I think the world is tilting towards NFTs, the crypto world. And I don't think that was anticipated, but I think that that's the kind of the direction where a lot of folks are headed. And I'm looking forward to the moment when we have DAOs of people writing stories together, creating content together, and really building communities together. I think that's going to be pretty fascinating.
Julia?
I would say I think there's so much development happening now. a lot of projects haven't shipped yet. So I think in like 6 months to a year, the available tools to people wanting to create DAOs or DAO ecosystems will be so much more robust. And I'm like very, very excited to see sort of like how these coordination Legos actually start to click together, and what comes of that. I think Aaron sort of mentioned this too. I think a key KPI to keep track on is just sort of like diversification, both of treasuries and how these really, really bloated treasuries start to actually spend and fund their own ecosystems, but also people and how new structures are being built and how new people are being brought into these ecosystems. So I think that's something to just keep an eye on, is how participation is growing.
Kevin, give you the last word.
Yeah, I was just paging through the DAO report that we launched last week, looking for the hottest take possible. And where I landed was I'm really excited about the intersection of digital identity and DAOs. And what I think is really exciting about that is that we can basically start reinventing what the resume is, and what workers' reputation is, by looking at what DAOs they've been in, what tasks they've done, what pods or work streams that they worked in, and I envision a world in which many knowledge workers are working for DAOs instead of companies, and you're building a resume and a reputation in the metaverse by working with and for multiple DAOs at once and building relationships in the networked age. And that to me is a lot of fun to think about, and also to plan for a world where people are getting a lot of their compensation on chain. Forgive me for dropping the name of my brand, but they will be getting coins from these DAOs, and it's kind of going to be a real tipping point when people are earning more from DAOs than they are for traditional companies. And the big thought that I would leave everyone with is that 99% of the world, their financial lives is their careers, not their investments. And so if you have, if we are able to build a workforce with DAOs, then crypto can go more mainstream, because we can work those people who need to provide for their family, pay their mortgage. And I think that's going to be the ultimate legacy of DAOs.
Awesome. And I'm probably not the only one, Kevin. Drop a link in the chat if you can to that DAO report that you mentioned from Gitcoin, because I didn't know about that.
Totally, will do.
Yep. Thanks so much, everyone. This was really great. And there was totally lots of vibes here, and there will be lots of vibes at Mainnet 2021. I don't know. I had to do it. I had to say that. Mainnet 2021 is next week. So if you haven't grabbed your passes, I'm going to put a link into the chat, not to compete with Kevin's DAO report, but I'll put a link in the chat that gets you $450 off your Mainnet pass if you're coming in person. There's also a virtual platform, so if you can't come to New York, you can see all these guys at Mainnet next week, Monday through Wednesday, September 20th through 22nd. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone. We will see you next week.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.